Over the last 15 years or so, in connection with a number of different programmes I've written and produced about the Second World War, I've met a number of people who worked alongside Adolf Hitler. And I've selected just 3 interviews with people who knew Hitler at different stages of the Nazi dictatorship for you to meet in this programme. But first, a warning. There have been more books written about Adolf Hitler than any other person of the 20th century. Millions of words and countless hours of debate on his motivation and his personality. So here, in less than half an hour, I can't promise we can do more than raise some questions and give some, what I hope, are intriguing insights. And of course, there's a danger, isn't there, in listening to the testimony of supporters of the Nazi regime about Hitler. Not only are their words fragmentary, they're also liable to be partial. After all, no individual tortured as a result of Hitler's policies knew him directly and survived to be interviewed. So with all of that in mind, let's hear from our first witness, Karl Böhm-Tettelbach. I interviewed him in Cologne in 1996 for a series called Nazis, A Warning from History. As a young Luftwaffe officer, Böhm-Tettelbach worked closely with the German Minister of Defense, Blomberg, and as a consequence spent time at Hitler's house in Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian mountains.
We were there at the Berghof and lived together with Hitler in his home. In the morning he took long walks, about 2 hours walk in the park, beautiful weather in the mountains, and we followed about 50 meters behind them. We could look at the snow-covered hills there. That just was wonderful. Then he even took us up to the tea house. He loved to discuss the future of Germany in the scenery which stimulated him. At night he liked to see film, especially Heinz Rühmann was his favorite actor. And sat in the first row in a comfy chair and slapped his knees when something funny came. He didn't like the Western or criminal films. He loved humor.
Mein neuer Hut! Emil, retten Sie ihn!
Hitler was very friendly and charming as a host, not wild and shouting, talking elegant and laughing. And he had a charisma. I call it a flair, which nobody else had.
Charismatic, friendly, an elegant talker with a good sense of humour. Do you recognise Adolf Hitler, author of The Destruction of Millions? And that's, of course, simultaneously the problem and the benefit of this kind of testimony. It's a problem because Karl Böhm-Tettelbach was already predisposed to admire the man he thought was rescuing Germany in the 1930s. But it's also a benefit because it reminds us not to caricature Hitler as a carpet-biting madman. But as you can imagine, I wanted very much to challenge Karl Böhm-Tettelbach on this universally positive view of Hitler. So I asked him this. But how can somebody see Jews lose their jobs, be forced to leave the country as a result of the views of Hitler and the Nazis, and not go, this is terrible, I don't want to support or be anything to do with this regime now?
No, that never came up because you were lost. Everybody thought the same you thought, and you're in a big team, a big group, and you didn't separate from the group. You were infected. That explains it a little bit. And by the way, a young person, pilot, flying all day long, he didn't want to discuss these problems, and they never came up in the officers' mess. We came home and had a nice flight and our dinner, and then went to bed or went out dancing.
But Karl Böhm-Tettelbach's enjoyable, if highly selective, existence took a very different turn after the war began. He eventually was posted, along with others in Hitler's entourage, to the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia. Here, after the war began to turn against the Nazis in the wake of the Battle of Stalingrad, he witnessed Hitler's remarkable powers of persuasion when senior officers arrived and sought to change their Führer's mind.
Remarkable. Sometimes they came, they were furious and said that I want to know his mood because I'm going to give him hell. He should know what's going on. And then he really found some nasty words, criticized Hitler. And then at night when I got him back and he said, Böhm, excuse me, I was mad today, but I made a mistake. Hitler convinced me that it was justified now, and I'm wrong. I didn't know what he knows, but therefore I feel sorry. So he showed up angry and left enthusiastically and flabbergasted. Very strange, very strange.
Did you like him?
No. Well, like it, I have to find a different word. At that time, I respected him. He impressed me, and he made me tense. Whenever I was near him, I was, in every respect, prepared to watch out.
Böhm-Tettelbach was prepared to serve Hitler so faithfully, not only because of the Führer's personal qualities, but also because of one other crucial reason.
The whole army and Air Force and Navy, they all had to take the oath that we would follow Hitler, and he was our supreme commander.
And how seriously did you and your colleagues take this oath?
Very serious. I mean, this accompanied my whole life till the very end.
Böhm-Tettelbach was serving at the Wolf's Lair on July the 20th, 1944, when, as a result of a plot by German officers, a bomb exploded just feet away from Hitler. The man who placed it there was Count von Stauffenberg. Did you approve of what Stauffenberg did?
No, I don't approve.
If you had been approached, what would you have said to Stauffenberg?
I said to Stauffenberg, I would have said, I'm going to report that to Hitler that you want to kill him.
Why?
Yeah.
Why would you have done this?
Yeah, I had no other choice. If I would have stayed quiet, they would put me down in a little notebook and I would be shot. There was no other way.
Well, maybe to join the plot and try and make it succeed.
Yeah, well, no, I know the plot. They could not. Impossible to overtake Hitler and his Reich. Now, to kill Hitler, I don't consider that's difficult to do. That's easy. But Himmler must be replaced. Göring must be replaced. Goebbels and many other people. Nobody approached me because they knew that I wouldn't break my oath.
I still vividly remember how surprised I was during that interview when Karl Böhm-Tettelbach said he wouldn't have taken part in the plot against Hitler. But archive research that we later did of letters and diaries of the time confirmed that many German soldiers actually felt the same way, that this plot against their Führer was some kind of betrayal. Hitler, of course, was still very much alive after the bomb plot, although, as Böhm-Tettelbach discovered, a somewhat changed man.
After the attack, after the bomb exploded, I noticed his hand was trembling, and he was a little bit roughened, and he was not as friendly. He was tougher, and you could be scared a little bit about. You had to really watch out whatever you reported. You had to have use good words and know your business. But his hand was trembling. I think that was his sickness he had. That was not a result of the bomb.
Looking back on this extraordinary period and your time in it,
Are there any lessons that you draw out from it?
Yes, yes. I was quite young, lieutenant, first lieutenant, very young, starting 25 years old. My dream was disillusioned. I met Hitler as a normal man, and at the very end, when he was dead, he was a horrible, horrible man. So therefore, you really have to judge somebody personally very thoroughly before you depend on him and throw your life into his lap.
Karl Böhm-Tettelbach's conclusion about just what he learnt from his time with Hitler is also fairly typical of the responses other former supporters of the Nazi regime have given me to similar questions over the years. You know, it's as if they want to divide up the Third Reich into two convenient chunks. There was the good Hitler of the 1930s and the bad Hitler of the war and the Holocaust. But the history's not that simple, since Hitler never hid his brutal, inhumane, racist views during the 1930s. But we must remember that despite this, the 30s was still seen by many Germans as a positive time of regeneration. That's certainly the view of the next person I want you to meet in a few moments, Reinhard Spitzy, who also offers valuable insights into just what it was like to spend time with Adolf Hitler.
It has been the nicest days of my life when we entered in Austria. I entered with Hitler in the 6th car. No, I had tears in my eyes. All my dreams of reuniting Austria with Germany after the defeat of the year 18 in Versailles, for us it was a dream. The Anschluss was one of the successes of Hitler without war. And what he did is perfectly in order.
But what was clearly not perfectly in order was the treatment of the Austrian Jews. In Vienna, Nazi thugs and their supporters humiliated and hurt Jews in countless ways. The brutality was sudden and pervasive.
What was really a shame was the treating of the Jews. I knew so many Jews who have been patriots. And Hitler would have been so easy to say it's the Eastern Jews we don't like, coming from Poland and so on. But all who had the Iron Cross and so on, they can enter the party and all that. He would have such a help. And that was ununderstandable.
No matter how much you research these kinds of interviews beforehand, you know you can never predict exactly what people will say. And that answer was a case in point. When Reinhard Spitzy began talking about Hitler's so-called mistake about the Jews, I thought he was going to go on to say that the whole persecution of the Jews was wrong. Instead, as you've seen, he says that the Eastern Jews should have been singled out by Hitler, not the German ones. Thus giving us, I think, an insight into his own thinking that he was perhaps unaware of at the time. As Spitzy observed Hitler at close quarters in the 1930s, he was also struck by his furious attitude towards senior officers in the armed forces.
He once said, "My generals should be like bull terriers, on chains, and they should want war, war, war. And I have to put brakes on the whole thing. But what happens now? I want to go ahead with my strong politics, and the generals try to stop me."
Only up to a point, of course, since the generals didn't stop Hitler making war. In fact, many of them enthusiastically served him. But once the war started to go wrong for the Nazis, well then Reinhard Spitzy believed Hitler changed.
For my opinion, since 1943 he was no more normal. He was as abnormal as Caligula, as Nero, as Tiberius, as the Russian the cruel Ivan the Cruel.
Again, it's the same mistaken analysis, isn't it? Of the good Hitler who somehow only goes bad in the midst of war. An analysis that may make some kind of sense from one person's point of view, but which simply isn't tenable from a wider historical perspective. But with Reinhard Spitzy, there was a twist to this familiar story. Because even after knowing the details of what Hitler did, most notably the persecution of the Jews, the horrors of the Holocaust, even after knowing all that, this was still Herr Spitzy's final verdict on his old boss.
I was asked one day what I would do if Hitler would still be alive and come here. I would tell him, Mein Führer, what have you done, O Lord? But come, I hide you in a mountain resort somewhere else, no? Because personally, I can't complain.
Spitzy's logic is pretty simple here, isn't it? I found Hitler to be an impressive person, so you know the crimes don't really matter. Logical argument simply fails, doesn't it, in the face of such a response? Let's move on to someone who was a good deal less committed a supporter of the Nazis and who worked with Hitler in the last stages of the war. He's Ulrich de Maizière, and I met him in the Rhineland in 1997. As a 25-year-old officer of the German General Staff, he spent time both at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia and in the bunker underneath the Reichschancellery in Berlin.
By that time, Hitler was already a sick man with a severe shaking paralysis in his arm and a shuffling gait. But he had lost none of his demonic charisma. It is indescribable, this personal effect that he had, this fascination, this demonic power. You have to have experienced it to understand why people always fell for him. Those who were constantly in his environment, take Keitel or Dönitz or Jodl or Goering, they could no longer escape his orbit, his effect. There are people who haven't managed it even 40 years later.
It's certainly true of the German elite that some of them did fall under Hitler's spell. In the 1930s, for instance, the Minister of Defense, von Blumberg, used to say that Hitler was so extraordinary that just shaking his hand would cure him of colds. But by this time, the Hitler of the so-called miracles had long disappeared. And now there were those, like de Maizière, who even questioned their Führer's sanity.
He was a man who was mentally ill. He was convinced, and I heard this from his own mouth, that the German nation would not survive his end and the end of National Socialism. It would be destined to collapse. It's hard to explain how such a man retained the loyalty of a nation of 80 million people right to the very end. I believe it is due to inordinate self-belief, his personal charisma, and his abundance of criminal energy. That, for me, is the key.
Well, that's an interesting view. But I'd be very careful about taking de Maizière's explanation of the Nazi phenomenon as the best way of understanding what actually happened. Because he, in common with many Germans of my experience who lived through these times, wants to pin the reason the Nazis fought to the very end on the personality of Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm not for a minute denying that Hitler's personality was remarkable. It was wholly destructive in essence, of course, but it was still remarkable. However, there were other reasons why the Germans fought to the very end. More than anything, I think, and this is a judgment I've come to after talking to many eyewitnesses of the time, it was fear of Stalin's Red Army and the vengeance they would wreak on Germany that was the main reason why they wanted to fight on. But naturally, you might think, All the people you've met in this programme, Karl Böhm-Tettelbach, Reinhard Spitzi, and Ulrich de Mazière, still focus hugely on the character of Hitler as the reason the Germans acted as they did. And whilst I think, as I've just said, they rather overemphasised the role of Hitler in all this, I do hope you agree with me that their views have been extremely instructive for us to listen to.